It doesn't seem like there's a plot, just this continuing questions of, is she going to make it? The film feels like a documentary, like I'm looking at things that people would prefer to keep private. In some ways, our Hollywood sensibility has softened our defenses. We cut away from the uncomfortable scene at a point so you don't look at something too long. And while Cassavetes isn't rubbing your nose in the film, he is holding your head so you have to stare at something you're not used to. Those are words from actor-director John Cameron Mitchell on John Cassavetes' 1974 film, A Woman Under the Influence. Seeing Faces in Movies is a podcast where each month I focus on the works of a different director or cinematographer, and each week I invite a guest on to discuss the film and the artist's filmography. Today's film in question is A Woman Under the Influence. So quick synopsis of the film is, although wife and mother Mabel is loved by her husband Nick, her mental illness places a strain on the marriage. The film stars Jenna Rollins as Mabel Longhetti, Peter Falk as Nick Longhetti, Catherine Cassavetes as Margaret Longhetti, Lady Rollins as Martha Mortensen, and Fred Draper as George Mortensen. It's written by John Cassavetes, uncredited cinematography by Mitch Bright and Al Rubin, directed by John Cassavetes, edited by David Armstrong, Sheila Visseltier, and Beth Bergeron, and music by Bo Harwood. So today my guest is Rolo Tony, and I know him from Twitter essentially, and we kind of started following each other, just having mutual interest in same type of films. I feel like the first time we might have talked was during one of the film club picks that was Videodrome, and then you started doing a few spaces on your own. I remember one of them being Mommie, Dearest, and just like the top of Joan Crawford, who is the love of my life. And I just was like, okay, this is a guy who knows his stuff. We are into the same type of movies. We happen to be living in the same city. So Toronto's got a lot of film fans. So thank you so much for coming on the show. I was so glad you said yes. And I'm very excited to have you on.
I'm so happy you had me on. I really enjoyed our conversations in those circles, or not circles, I guess spaces in the past. Mm-hmm. Remember my first impression of you was I saw you like gushing about The Swimmer. And like, that's one of my personal all-time favorite films as well. That was one of those things where I was like, no one really knows about this movie. You know about this movie. I think we're going to be friends. I think we got this. Yeah. When it came to talking about this film today, of course I had to say yes. You know, this is one of my favorite movies of all time. And I think that we're going to have a great discussion about it.
I'm excited to get into it. But before that, what I'd like to do is ask you kind of what your relationship is to cinema. Like, when did you sort of start to get into watching films on a more serious level? And then how did you get into Cassavetes' work?
Well, it all kind of started for me, like my earliest memory is when I was 4 years old and I watched Jurassic Park for the first time. And since then, I've been obsessed with the work of Spielberg, of course, because, you know, who isn't, right? I think anyone like Gen X beyond is just automatically obsessed with Spielberg. But when it comes to my more serious, in quotations, off the deep end, I guess, would be when I kind of discovered, I guess in high school, I really started to get into more serious filmmaking. And I got into the more cliche people first. Like I got into Tarantino, I got into PTA. But the thing that I noticed like very early on was that like I was watching more than most people, and I was watching foreign films way more than other people. I bring that up because one of my favorite directors growing up was Bong Joon-ho. And that really got me into like South Korean cinema way before like the big booms, right? When it comes to Cassavetes specifically, the story of me and Cassavetes is the story of me and the Criterion Collection, because I had known about the Criterion Collection for years, right? And for a long time, I kind of saw myself as above the Criterion Collection. I say that jokingly because I love to pirate things, right? I see it as morally good. I know Werner Herzog agrees with me. So do you. So does Harley Quinn. The reason I say all of that is because I had this perception that Criterion really wasn't worth it for me. But then I started to changed my approach to it, because rather than viewing it as like an overexpensive home media option, I saw it as a way for me just to explore instant great movies, right? And then what I took advantage of was those half price sales, right? And the first one of those I ever did was Akiru, the Akira Kurosawa film, My Own Private Idaho, the Gus Van Sant film, and the Cassavetes 5-film box set. And the first film I watched on that box set was A Woman Under the Influence. And I think I watched that film 2 or 3 more times before I watched any of the other films on that box set. Yeah. I guess the thing that drew me to Cassavetes was I studied a lot of drama in high school, and I took it mainly as a way to get out of, actually hard courses. But what I found was I really loved the theater. And I specifically got really into Death of a Salesman and Beckett. And as soon as I heard that there was this filmmaker who had this playwright approach to filmmaking, I knew I had to get into him.
There's so many things that you said that I identify with. I think it's weird because I think right now where we're at in film society, people kind of look down on people like Tarantino or PTA, maybe less so PTA, but they give them a hard time. But we need those people for our generation, because from those people is where you branch off to the people that influence them. Like, you need someone as a gateway, right? You're not going to be coming out of, as a 10-year-old watching Fellini. You need someone who gets you onto that. So this is a film with so much history. I don't know. It's one of those films that I've watched several times. Every time it blows me away in so many different ways. And there's so much about it in the making of it and reading about it that I just find wild. So I wanted to get into a couple facts. And so one of the first ones that both kind of blew my mind and upset me a little bit was that Cassavetes couldn't find a distributor for the film after it was completed. And he was at like one point literally carrying the reels under his arm from one theater to another, hoping that people would play the movie. And then finally Scorsese, who recently, became big at that point with Mean Streets, he had recently released that, was a huge fan of Cassavetes, as he would be. And he threatened to pull his film Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore from the New York Film Festival unless they accepted A Woman Under the Influence.
Wow.
At this point, like, Cassavetes is a known person, right? It's not like he was a nobody. He's an actor and he's done films.
He was friends with Scorsese before then, right?
They were friends.
I remember reading a quote about when Scorsese was making Boxcar Bertha. He was like, don't worry, Scorsese, you're making a big piece of shit. But like from here on out, you're going to be able to do whatever you want, right? And I feel like maybe that instance was what caused Scorsese to support A Woman Under the Influence so much years later, right?
People can say whatever they want about Scorsese, but this man goes out of his way to support cinema. That's what you want in a director. But to me, it's just wild the fact that we could have lived in a world without this film having been released, which makes me sad to think about that possibility. To me, this is my favorite Cassavetes, like hands down.
Oh yeah.
There's no question about
100%. I think that like you see in his other films going kind of forward that he kind of tried to recapture the same energy again. And we could talk more about those other films, but I don't think he ever quite did. But something to talk about with specifically Scorsese in relation to Cassavetes, and I guess both of their spirits, right? A Woman Under the Influence very easily could have been lost to the sands of time, right? Like people at that era didn't really care about film preservation, and they would just burn their film when they were done. But I say all of this because I think Scorsese and Cassavetes, they're cut from a similar cloth of American independent filmmaking, which is that they're more interested in community in the sense of building each other up, right? Like they don't really see competition as something that is necessary in the filmmaking landscape. And if we compare it to the way things are now, right? Like the sense of community in the filmmaking world, unless you're talking about specific genres, right? Like if we're talking about horror filmmakers or we're talking about comedy filmmakers, right? They all stick together. But when it comes to filmmakers, for the sense of art, for the sake of pushing the medium forward, it's kind of sad that Cassavetes and Scorsese are like the last of a dying breed in that sense. I think that's something that we see in all of Cassavetes' films is that if it's not from the heart, if it's not from the family, if it's not from your friends, then it's not worth doing, right? Like it's just like you don't do it unless you put everything of yourself into it. And I really fucking admire it. I think it's a really strong. It speaks a lot about Cassavetes' character. I think that a director, in order to be that empathetic to other people in the sphere, as well as his collaborators, that speaks a lot to somebody who actually cares about the people in their life, who actually listens. And I think that anybody who wants to direct, they need to listen to that.
Oh, yeah. I think anyone who wants to direct should be basically worshiping at the church of Cassavetes. He is an actor's director. It also helps that he was an actor as well, but he's someone who wants to uplift and get the best out of his actors. He's not trying to overshadow, even when he is in a film. Well, Cassavetes initially wrote this as a play because his wife, Jenna Rollins, wanted him to write a role for her that would kind of push the boundaries. When she read the script, she realized, okay, I love this, but it's going to be too much to play night after night in a play. So let's turn it into a film, because I cannot do this night after night on the stage.
I think if we wanted to peer into that world, right, we just watch opening night, right? Because I feel like that's what would have happened if Gina Rollins would have tried to do A Woman Under the Influence every night. I don't think that she could have done it. I don't think that anyone could have done it, right? Because this is such a tough role. This is such a tough role to... You have to have ambiguity, and you have to have things that you can't deny, right? And when I say that there are things you can't deny, one of the things is you can't deny the fact that there is something up with Mabel, right? Yes. And when it comes to performing that every night, there is a real place of helplessness that Rollins has to get to as a performer, right? Many people may think that it might be like the tics or, like the big, like exaggerated movements that would take it out of her. But honestly, I think it's the headspace. When I think about Mabel in A Woman Under the Influence, I see her as like a bird in like a cage, right? I don't see her. I see her as like an animal in an exhibit. I don't see her as like somebody who's interacting naturally in the world. And to be like not just that character, but then also literally on a stage with a live audience, that disconnect would be so weird, I guess, as a performer, right? I don't know.
No, I definitely agree. And we'll get into it as well, but I don't know what kind of person you would have to be not to just feel for this woman and see the way, as Nick said in one of the points, her mind gets ahead of her and takes control of her, essentially. Doesn't matter how many times you watch this movie, it has the same effect. And it's weird because this movie's 2.5 hours long. It both feels like no time has passed, but then you feel so drained at the end. Like it doesn't feel like 2.5 hours. And that to me is the highest compliment you could pay a film, where I'm like, I did not feel 2.5 hours, because 2.5, you can have a 70-minute long film that feels like it's like 4 hours long. This does not feel, it's like you start and then you're done and you realize, oh, I am exhausted. But in a good way, exhausted.
To go off of your note there of smaller films sometimes feeling longer, right? I actually rewatched Tetsuo the Iron Man recently. And that movie, like the last act, I'm over that movie by that point, right? Like by that point, it is placed all of its cards on the table. You already know what all the tricks are. You already know what it's kind of saying. So then the rest of the movie is just kind of watching things for the sake of the fun of it, right? And that's enjoyable, right? But also at the same time, I want a bit more. With A Woman Under the Influence, right? It always speeds by, but I always feel the runtime right when we cut to Nick 6 months later, when they're waiting for Mabel to come back from the institution. And it's totally on purpose on Cassavetes' end. We really feel like the lack of Mabel's presence. And every time I get to that part in the film, I'm always like checking my clock, like when's Gina coming back? I want Gina back on screen. And that's not to say I don't like Peter Falk. In fact, I think that actually is a credit to Peter Falk, the fact that we feel that in those moments.
And like you said, it is a credit to Falk's performance, because he is also waiting. And you can tell that he's like counting down the days, the hours, the minutes. Yeah, I'm definitely going to be talking about the performances, because this is
Oh yeah.
That's the movie. A couple little quick facts, so I'll just rapid fire. Well, one, they didn't have any rehearsals for it other than the initial table read. And a lot of the time it would seem like they were rehearsing, but Cassavetes was filming. So sometimes what we might have seen was to the actors like kind of a rehearsal, but he was like, why not use it? This is a great take. So let's just use it. This is the only time Cassavetes was nominated for Best Director. And the last fact that's not even really about the making of this film, but Richard Dreyfuss claimed that he found the film so harrowing when he first saw it, it caused him to vomit. That's how I'm going to end my fun fact.
That last fun fact is interesting because doesn't Richard Dreyfuss suffer from bipolar disorder?
Does he?
I'm pretty sure he does. Like, I'm like 90% certain he does. It's either him or Scheider. I know that it's like one of the main cast of Jaws suffers from bipolar disorder, and they're very open about it. So my guess would be that the reason that, you know, he even had a quote on the film was that he has those struggles themselves. I love that you brought up the way that they shot the film with the lighting, because I was listening to a Q&A conversation about that, and apparently it was wonderful for the actors. Like they, you know, were able to stop and start whenever they wanted to. But apparently the oldest child was the only person on set who would always know when they were recording. So Cassavetes, he said that they had like dozens of takes that were incredible, but they were ruined because the little girl was looking directly into the camera smiling. Which
oh my God, that's funny.
Oh,
I actually looked her up last night because I was like, what else has she been in? Because she plays a prominent enough role out of the three kids, because they have three kids. You always hear them, Maria. This is the only time she was ever in anything.
Really?
She must have been like a friend of someone's friend, like kid, you know, that they were just like,
The oldest son is Seymour Cassell's son, and Seymour Cassell is, of course, honestly, I think Seymour.
One of the first things I kind of want to talk about is it's hard not to talk about a director's work, and that's what I kind of like doing on this show. Is the reason why I highlight different directors is we're talking about the film in question, but we want to talk about their body of work and their style. And Cassavetes often highlights flawed women. People can take it one way or the other. As someone who is a woman, identifies as a woman, I appreciate the way he makes women very honest, as opposed to putting them on some sort of pedestal that we can never achieve, or making them nasty villains. They're never villains. They're never nasty. They're just real people. And it's not often that women get to be real people on films. There has to be a reason why they're this way, as opposed to this is just the way they are. We see that a lot. We see that in this film. This one ties in mental health issues as well. Going to read a quote from Cassavetes himself about Mabel and the concept of, is she mentally ill? Is she not? So he says, I believe very strongly that all women who are married for any length of time, and if they love their husbands, they don't have any place to put their emotions, and that can drive them crazy. This particular woman, I don't think she's crazy. I think she's just frustrated beyond belief. More than being crazy, I think she's just socially inept. So that's a loaded quote. Sometimes I think the beauty of art is that the artist can have an intent, but it's up to the audience to, you know, interpret things as they want. I definitely think Mabel has a mental illness. I think she's also socially inept. She can be both things. As much as he thinks that he wrote a woman who wasn't mentally ill, I think he definitely did. It got away from him, I guess. How do you feel about what his vision is of Mabel and your interpretation of Mabel?
Well, we're talking about a unique director in this case because the lead actress is his wife, right? And because of that, they're going to have deeper conversations about the role. And if you ever listen or read about their relationship, you'll come to find quickly that they were very close. They were inseparable, and they would speak Greek to one another because that was a good way of having their own language to keep things separate. But when it comes to Mabel as a character, I get that Cassavetes sees her in that way. But what's interesting is that he also sees her as partially complicit in her own issues and her own downfall, right?
Yeah.
But I think that what makes A Woman Under the Influence sing is Mabel. It's Gina Rollins. I think
Mhm.
that rather than the artist having their own work get away from them, I think that Gina actually secretly makes the film better because
Oh,
she
yeah.
sees something in the material that Cassavetes himself doesn't recognize. Cassavetes, when he wrote this film, he talks about how he became Mabel for a bit when he was writing it. To touch on what you were saying before about women characters, I think that he uses women as a conduit to get to the heart of harder to discuss or harder to appreciate societal issues.
Mhm.
And this kind of relates to the style of acting that Cassavetes used to teach with Burt Lane. I read about this where Burt Lane and him, they essentially hated the method.
Yeah.
And they developed an acting style that involved characters having to wear masks, or essentially a character who tells lies in order to pretend to be someone else, right?
Okay.
Now, when we relate that to the idea of women living in society, the idea of I have to act a certain way when I'm in this specific situation, or else there will be something, or else they'll be held to pay, right? That's essentially the whole conflict of a woman under the influence. It's Mabel, she has something up with her, but at the same time, you can see the way that she could function in the world. The thing that causes her to crack is the lack of attention from her husband, the lack of love and warmth from the rest of her family, and the lack of true being seen. She needs to be seen. She needs to be heard. She needs space to sing, to dance, right? But oftentimes she's left alone. She's left in a house. Anytime she tries to make decisions for herself, somebody bigger or supposedly so comes in and tells her not to do that and to do something different. To bring this all down to the women element, because I think that's a very important point you bring up there. Women in society at that time were not afforded the same allowances that men were. And what I would posit in this conversation is less so is Mabel crazy, right? But rather, is Nick crazy?
Yes, exactly.
I believe so
that.
as well.
Yes, that's definitely something I was going to talk about as well. And
the reason I bring that up, right, is because a lot of this film kind of unlocks itself when you spend more of your time looking at how Mabel and Nick's parents interact with them rather than directly between the two of them. Because the main thing I saw with Nick's mom, played by John Cassavetes' mom, actually, which is funny, she did the duties of a wife in quotations, but then she also was very judgmental and she was very focused on the way that things were supposed to be. And that's Nick's whole deal. But the ultimate oxymoron with Nick is that he himself is not normal.
It's exactly that. And I noticed it specifically on this watch and then also reading is that Nick is so focused on having a happy family and appearing happy. And but that it makes him angry and he's just yelling at people. Be happy, be normal, have a fun time. But it's like, you're yelling at me. So I'm not going to have a fun time if you just yelled at me to get on the beach, So, and it's like at the old school way of parenting. Like I see it in my parents and I see it in my grandparents, other people's parents have just been, this is the way it's supposed to be. And they can't get out of that mindset. And sometimes it's like, it's not even worth fighting them.
Now, something I wanted to ask you about the Nick paradigm that we both agree on, I guess, is that do you think that what's driving him crazy is the fact that Mabel doesn't do these things? Or is he driven crazy by society putting those perceptions onto them?
I would say it's the latter, because one of the first scenes with him when he's talking to his coworker being like, I gotta get home. And the coworker, his friend, I guess, is like, oh, Mabel's going to be going crazy, essentially. And he's like, no, this woman, she cooks, she cleans, she scrubs the floors, she cleans the bathrooms. And he's essentially telling him, this woman does so much for me. She's essentially in his mind sensitive. That's how they keep referring to her as, is overly sensitive. So I don't think that he doesn't think that she does all these things, because she does. And we see her do. We see her get on the floor, scrubbing the floors, and he goes and kisses her at some point because he's like, he appreciates what she does. I think it's like kind of like an embarrassment that people are embarrassed of being around her. It's not like they don't like her. They feel bad for her. And you can sense that discomfort, and he doesn't like that because for him, it looks bad on him, I guess, in his mind.
I don't know if I'm a crazy person for holding this belief, but I'm going to throw it out there, right?
Mm,
I don't think that Nick's coworkers really care that Mabel's got problems. I don't think that
mm,
they actually pass much judgment on Mabel, right? And I think that most of the awkwardness that comes in that first breakfast spaghetti dinner, which I
yeah,
love that they always eat spaghetti. That's like my
yeah,
favorite detail in the whole film.
same.
But with Nick's coworkers, right? Like Nick always is trying to sell them that Mabel is specific ways, but then when they come over, she doesn't clean, she doesn't cook, she doesn't do anything. She just gets overwhelmed and forgets all of them. She doesn't remember their names, right?
Hmm.
And the thing that sets the tension off for me in that scene and throughout the rest of the film, of course, is Nick getting mad that things are wrong and
Yeah.
nobody else is really making too much of a big deal about it, right? Like there's that moment where Mabel gets really close to the guy's face as he's singing, right?
Hmm.
And he doesn't even really seem to care. Like he lets her
No.
do it, right? It's Nick who starts to yell that really escalates the situation, right? So
Hmm.
I agree with you. I agree with you that I think it's the societal pressures. This is one of those movies where they don't really need to show you much of the literal background of a relationship to actually
Yeah.
know what the relationship was before. When I watched this movie, I see like a younger Nick and Mabel where like Nick is aware of these issues and he like lets it slide so he could be with her. And
Hmm.
I think that what we're watching over the course of this film, I think this is the start of an abusive relationship.
And it is. And there's that scene after he first hits her. And if we'll track back, the scene that leads up to that is her kids, and I think it's like a neighbor's kids are going to have a play date. The dad stays on because I think right off the bat, he's like, something is a little bit off about Mabel that he's not used to. So he stays around because he initially was just going to drop them off, come pick them up. She tells the kids to go dress up. They're in her closets. Nick gets home and he sees his daughter running around naked. The grandmother, Nick's mom, asks, "Why are you naked? Who took off your clothes?" She says, "Mom did." We don't actually see that scene. We don't know. Kids lie. Mabel could have also told her to take off the clothes that she was wearing to dress into something else. That's beside the point. Nick gets upstairs and he sees the neighbor up there. He's confused. I think he kind of knows what's happening, but he's so amped up at that point that he doesn't care. He's angry and he slaps Mabel. Later on, Mabel discusses, she says to him, she's like, "You've never done this before. I know why you did it. You've never done this. You and I understand each other." She's trying to excuse his behavior for it. And it's sad. And I do believe that he probably hasn't done it before, but he has been aggressive towards her. Just because you haven't been physically aggressive doesn't mean he hasn't been aggressive. You could tell he at the core of him, there's anger boiling up in him. And it was going to come out in some sort of way, one way or the other. It just was there. And I do agree it is an abusive relationship because he doesn't know how to deal with it. He wants to make her better by just saying, "Be happy." And that's not going to work.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that he is so much more interested in like upholding the standard patriarchal ideals, right? The
Mm-hmm.
party in question, the only reason that the party happened was because Mabel was trying to get the kids ready for school, and Nick decided to use that as a time to do a power play where he gets the kids to whistle, right? And that's what triggers Mabel to be like, when we get home, we're gonna have a party, right?
Yeah.
And that right there shows you everything, right? Because it shows you that Nick doesn't really care about the practicalities of life. He just wants
Mm-hmm.
to, I guess, like oppress his wife. He wants to like make her commands seem like nothing in the eyes
Mm-hmm.
of her children. And Mabel already recognized that issue. And then the idea of him coming home to slap her, right? What was interesting was that Mabel calls Nick to let her know that she started to throw the party, and he
Mm-hmm.
hangs up on her. He hangs up on her and rushes over with the mom to slap her,
Yeah.
right? He heard her talk about the party. He heard her discuss the chance of doing that. But what made him drive home was her actually doing it. He didn't actually think that she was going to do the party. That's crazy.
Yeah.
That's, he doesn't expect the most from her. He doesn't expect her to try to succeed. And when she actually does, he gets super mad and hits her, and it's disgusting.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing that's interesting, though, is we talk about the abuse, we talk about all those things, right? But I don't think that anyone who watches this film would deny the fact that Peter Falk and Gina Rollins have this like amazing chemistry, and
Oh,
you
yeah.
can actually see why those characters fell in love in the first place.
Oh, 100%. Even if we bring it back to the scene where the spaghetti breakfast scene, there's two ways you can read it. And I think probably the first time I watched it, he's looking at her and he's watching her and she's not always looking at him. But when their eyes meet, it looks like true love. And I do believe that he does love this woman. He just is trying to control her. You can love someone, you can try and control them as well. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. Doesn't mean just because you love someone, you're a good person or necessarily a bad person. Each time you watch it, I think the anger, because you know what's going to happen if you've seen it before, you can see the anger, but you can also see the worry in him because he wants the best for her, but because he wants the best for himself, essentially. He wants to appear like a normal guy who has a stay-at-home wife, 3 kids. You know, she's going to cook us all a meal. But even just the concept of him showing up to the house after he had to break their date for whatever, because he had to work, that's valid. But he shows up in the morning with a crew of men knowing that they're going to want to eat. And so she has to cook for these people. Like, that to me is the most wild thing. I was like, sir, I have not even woken up, let alone I'm going to now have to make spaghetti for everyone. And we can track back. I will track back eventually to what had happened with Mabel prior to that. But if we just stay on this, he expects her to be a certain way, probably because that's how his mom was. That's how her mom was. So in his mind, he's like, this is how women should be. This is the wife that I'm providing for you. This is what you're supposed to provide for me, which is sense of normalcy, essentially. Mm-hmm. He doesn't want to have the extra work. And it's a lot. It would be a lot for anyone to deal with a mother, a person in your life with mental illness, and you don't know how to address it. But he's going about it in the worst way, as we see.
It's odd because he's given like the worst scenes for her mental illness, and then also given some of the best scenes, right? I don't want to go too far into the later half of the movie, but when she comes home from the institution and he takes her away and he's saying, be yourself kind of thing, that shows that deep down he does love her core, right?
Yes.
And that's beautiful. That should be shown, right? Then on the flip side, the opening of the film where all those guys are coming in, right? There's such a lack of respect for boundaries there. Maybe like 40, 50 years ago, guys would expect that, right? But to like think in my head of like the concept of, let's say, bringing like 40 guys over while my girlfriend's like that's bananas.
I did want to talk about the title of the film, A Woman Under the Influence. I think if you're going into this film, you assume this is about alcoholism. At least that's what I thought. And there is a bit of that in this film. What you notice, though, is that it's really not about that. It's not about that type of influence. It's, the influence of Nick. It's the influence of other people who are trying to influence her into being someone she's not. And it's weird because if you Google this movie and you know how you see stills right off the bat, it's always of her in that scene where she's waiting for Nick and all the beer cans around. That makes it seem like it's about a woman who's an alcoholic. And she has that scene where she drinks a lot. And I'm sure she probably does. They allude to her drinking a lot, but it's not about that. How do you feel about that title, the way people view this film, and the fact that her drinking a lot is really not the root of the issue of, this film at all?
100%. And with this podcast, it's always important to put it in the context of the filmmaker, right? And I think that it really bears highlighting that the death of Cassavetes was caused by alcoholism. His liver failed. And when you tie that into the struggles of this film, it makes it way harder to watch. But regarding Mabel specifically, right? The alcohol is not so like, she's an alcoholic, but she's not an alcoholic in the sense that she enjoys the drinking. She does it because she's bored. She does it because no one's around. And her drinking Seagrams at the bar to impress the guy is not so much because she actually likes drinking Seagrams. It's because she wants to impress the guy. And the title Woman Under the Influence, it kind of sounds lame to say, but I don't think it's about alcohol. I think it's more so about societal pressures. I think that this is a film where it's talking about how like the creaking and the bending of like the pillars that hold up the weight in your mind, how they start to crumble. And it's an interesting film to kind of view that through the prism of, because I think that Cassavetes is kind of asking the question of whether or not any of our traditional society from the 70s, I guess, is actually natural, right? Like he's talking about like how capitalist, patriarchal, all those things, they're in place for decades, and we're watching like generations after the fact. This is what's happened. This is a woman who is under the influence of the society that it's created. And Nick, on the inverse of that, is also under the influence, but he's intoxicated and he loves the world that it's created. And he is bought into it. He is able to buy into it. And because he is bought into it, people excuse his eccentricities. Nobody ever calls him out for his problems, right? Because he just accepts it. And because he doesn't really call attention to it. Mabel is only a victim to their own issues because other people in her life, like, they refuse to interact. They refuse to engage because they see that as more messy for their own lives.
That's exactly that. There's so many scenes in this where even if we track it back to when she is waiting for Nick and she starts drinking, she's waiting for him. As you said, it's because she's bored. It's not because she's wanting to get drunk or she's angry. I mean, she's disappointed, but I don't think she's angry. She knows where he works. It's not like he was lying. We see that he's at work. Cassavetes could have not shown that, and we would have been like, is he doing something else? But he clearly showed this man's at work. We're all excusing the fact he's at work. So we're not angry with him either. She's a person with 3 kids. Her mother has them. She's worried that the mother has them. And she's sitting there like, now I don't know what to do with myself. This is also, it's a different time. It's not like she's like, oh, I can just put on a movie or I can go on the internet type of deal. She's sitting there. She has nothing to do. There's alcohol there. So why not drink and essentially kind of live a little? So she goes out and she's talking to people and she meets the guy who can tell right away this woman is drunk. And he takes advantage of that fact. He says, let's go back to your place. And he's forcing himself on her.
Wait, before we move there, right? Did you catch what the bartender says?
No, what did he say?
The last moment in that sequence, right? They get ready to leave and the gentleman pays for their drinks. You cut back to the bartender and the bartender looks to the guy who's picking up Mabel and he goes, good luck.
Oh, yeah.
It's pretty scuzzy. I don't know. Ooh.
Yeah.
Sorry, continue.
No, actually, as a side note to that, I was reading of people, kind of theorizing that this has happened before. So that could be like he knows her, or it's, good luck because she's drunk and she seems a little bit off. They get back to her place. He's forcing himself on her. She doesn't want it. And then it cuts to the morning and she's in bed and he's getting dressed. The implication is that they slept together or he successfully managed to take advantage of her. Either way, it's not good. And he's just kind of lingering. You kind of expect him to leave. She did mention Nick in a sort of way. She says, I set the kids off and he doesn't show up, whether he was listening to it or not. But then he's kind of playing off, I don't know if you're trying to use me as a way to get back at someone or other vice versa. And he's just kind of lingering in the place. He's like, I don't know what's going on with this woman, but he seems to be interested in the chaos that she brings. What I love about what Cassavetes does with that scene is that he could have had Nick walk into that situation and have him blow up. Because we kind of sense Nick's, I don't know if we sense Nick's personality right off the bat, or we just know Peter Falk is often cast as someone who has a bit of aggression. We kind of anticipate him going into the scene, losing his shit. We don't see that. They don't meet. He's gone by the time he shows up with his crew. How do you kind of feel about the fact that happens, is never addressed by Nick? It does come up again because his mom mentions it. And you kind of wonder, how does the mom know? And obviously there was a conversation that happened not on screen. And I think that's just the beauty of his writing. But how do you feel about that?
That was probably like one of the first like hooks that got me into the movie when I first watched it, right? Because, you watch a movie and you see like someone's being philanderous or, they're going behind their partner's back and you expect that to come up right away. That's a beginning of the movie kind of thing where it's like, okay, now they're going to be out on their own and they do whatever, right? But then the fact that they don't address it and then it only comes up later, secondhand from somebody else. And when Nick hears that, he doesn't even like add to it. He just laughs and sends her out of the room. I think that says everything, right? And now with the sequence with the guy and Mabel, right? I don't think that I hate to, talk this way sometimes about characters because sometimes it gives the impression that you're letting them off too easy, right?
Yeah.
But I don't think that it's Mabel's fault for doing these things. I think that this is literally like a mania psychosis kind of thing that's pushing her to this level, right? And we see later with the workers that she has these like memory gaps, these, problems with identifying people. And these are all things that you can trace to bipolar or BPD. And with this guy, he knows that something's wrong with her. He heard that she was married. I think the reason he gets mad at her when he's getting ready to leave is because he wants to create the closing of a door.
Yeah.
That guy's a scumbum, right? Like he's done this with a million women in the past. And my guess is that's his move. He's probably like using that as a way to where, oh, hey, you didn't tell me you were married. I'm out of here. Right. And that's his easy, quick leave. Right. There is a universe of this world, right, where like everyone's coming over and then Nick goes into the kitchen and then he sees them there. What are you doing? Whatever. Right. But even if we were to take the logic of it, I'm not even sure that Nick would do anything. I think that Nick would let him sit at the table. I think that Nick would not go for the confrontation because he's so much more somebody who would explode in the risk aversion rather than actually approach a confrontation.
I think if we show them getting into a fight about that, then we're putting some blame onto Mabel, and it's not what it's about. I don't think she's entirely to blame for that situation at all. So I'm glad that he didn't go down that route of trying to make her into someone that we don't fully trust or are not fully behind. So I appreciate that he did do that. I think where I wanted to go, and we kind of talked about it before, was, the concept of Nick being the male provider. Mabel is a stay-at-home mom. Nick is out working. He works long hours. He works a very physical, demanding, laborious job. And I think he likes that. Whether he likes his work or not, that's not the question. He likes the fact that he's the one coming home, bringing home the money, and she is to stay home, taking care of the kids. That's what he wants. He doesn't want her to have to lift a finger other than at home, essentially. And it makes him feel good that he's able to provide for the family because they own a house. They live in LA. They own a house. I mean, this is a different time. Obviously, you could own a house if you worked anywhere at that point, but it's not the biggest house because the kids. Like another thing I want to talk about was the house itself as being like the center. Is the kids are upstairs. The staircase plays a huge thing in this film, and they sleep downstairs in what is the living room, sort of dining room. And once they're done sleeping, it turns into their dining space. They're not struggling, but they're making sacrifices for their family. But it's very much that home is their center, and he wants to come home to a center that is what he finds to be comfortable, and it's being disrupted by Mabel's inability to be who he wants her to be. A writer was talking about Nick, and he says, Nick is a man who believes so passionately in his idea of perfect happiness, no matter how wrongheadedly, that he would rather destroy everyone around him than see it compromised. And I think that's very much Nick to the core. He's pushing everyone away because he wants them to come together, because he does not know how to process his emotions, because he's not well enough to process his emotions.
Yeah, he destroys it because he doesn't know how to keep things contained, like within like a easy to manage box, right? And we see this through like the several party scenes, right? But I think like the most important example of this would be when Mabel's coming back from the institution, right? And he doesn't ask people if it's a good idea until everyone is there, right?
Yeah.
A part of it is horrible on his end because he didn't even consider the emotions that his wife would be feeling coming back after all this time. But I think that it's even more indicative that it's more important to him to be seen as great in the eyes of many than to actually do something that's personally fulfilling, because he thinks that both are true. He thinks that like if you do one, you get the other. But in reality, life is about like, there's the thing that life wants you to do, and then there's the thing that makes you happy, right? And you have to it's a balance of what you can and what you can't. And the sequence when Mabel reaches out to her father and he does not stand up, that is Nick winning. And what's interesting to see in that scene is that Nick is the only person at that table that knows exactly what's happening as it's happening. You see it on his face. You see him as he's looking at all of the right people as it's happening. I bring that up because he thinks he's won by the end. He thinks that this is his world and everything is going to go back to like some form of normalcy. But I think that this is the start of the end, this film. I think this is the start of the disillusion and the crumbling of things. And it's because he refuses to interact and actually engage. Like, we see the way that Nick's supposed to be seen through his children. The end of the film, his kids don't even want to touch him. They don't even look at him. They watched him beat their mom, right? And now they don't want like anything to do with him. I think that Nick has a lot of love in his heart. I think that he does a lot of things to show that he cares. But by the end of the film, he puts all of the cards on the table. We now know what he is deep down, is that he would rather sacrifice his family's happiness than, you get the idea.
If we switch now back to kind of Mabel, she's a character that you can empathize with. As we mentioned, as we've been talking about, it would be very difficult. I don't know what kind of person you would have to be not to empathize with this woman. Whether you're able to identify with her is a different question, because there is the question of mental illness and just even her personality you might not identify with. Rollins is an incredibly physical performer. I think that's why, to me, when I think of the greatest actors and just actresses, I always think of her, because she's able to step into a role that makes you feel so much. And that, to me, is an incredible actor. And I think that's why she never was given any real sort of accolades, because how do you give an award to someone? That's how I'm trying to view it in my world. I mean, like, you can't, there's no award worthy of her work. I was reading a quote from a writer on the film criticism blog Spectrum Culture, and they say, Mabel is a character difficult to connect with, even embarrassing at times, yet sympathetic and understandable. Rollins extends herself tremendously with her performance, not just with indulging in outward manifestations, but being troubled via clothes or hair, or putting her whole body into it. And she has the thumb gestures that are barely perceptible, defensive posturing. You have Peter Falk in this movie, and you have other good performances, but this is her movie. I don't want to say that we wouldn't be talking about this movie if she hadn't been in it, but I don't know if we would, to be honest, because she is everything in this. Everything that she does, the little ticks that she does, the looks that she gives.
It's kind of a cliche, but they always say, like, study the first scene with a character to kind of learn what they're all about, right? And the first time that we see Mabel, it's her rushing to get her kids into the car with her mom so they can go away. And she's doing all of the regular motherly duties, right? But the thing that complicates things is that she's putting on her shoes in the process, right? So that immediately tells us that she is the kind of person to where she is doing, like, the normal society, like, needs to be done things at the same time as she's trying to do the personal things, right? And it shows that she's also not fully completing her tasks, right? Like, she can't fully stick to one through line or one ideology, and thus she's scattered. And also it shows us that she cares about her kids more than she cares about her own well-being. And she says later in the film, her kids come home from school, and she says, I've done nothing with my life. You guys are the only things I've ever done with my life, and I would never have it any other way. That's one of the most beautiful things a mother could ever say to their kid. When it comes to Rollins' performance as an actress in this, I always look at character actors as the most talented in the whole profession. And I think
agree.
That Rollins, right? And it's part of it is the lack of shame, right? They don't care how they see, and it matters entirely what's on the page rather than the vanity of an actor or an actress, right? And the reason I bring that up with Gina Rollins is that is seen throughout her entire career. She never really seemed to have any kind of larger pretensions about how she sees herself. And also she didn't really seem to care about conventional beauty or things like that in her roles or on screen. I say all of this because when we look at Mabel in A Woman Under the Influence, I think that she took the character to a place that no one else had gone before, partially because people were afraid to go there.
I mean, I agree with all of that. I think one of the last points I'll say about it is that what's interesting is that not only are we portraying a woman with mental illness, but she's also a mother, and she's dealing with the pressures of, well, you're a mother, you're supposed to be happy for your kids. You also have a husband who provides for you, who loves you. So why are you unhappy? Why are you this way? And it's the struggles of being a mother with mental illness, depression, and having to deal with kids. And she very much clearly loves her kids, like the scene that you were talking about. even when she comes home and she's like, I want to see my kids, Nick is like, not yet, because they're going to cry. You're going to cry. He doesn't want to make a scene. And his mother's like, why shouldn't she go see her kids? Let her go see her kids. And that scene is overwhelming when she sees her kids and they're saying, I love you. I miss you. I love you. She's overwhelmed. She has to exit the room. And then we get the rest of what we've talked about.
I thought I had this time around. I never thought about it this way, right? But like the way we shoot the scene, right? The way we see it, the way that Cassavetes captured it, he goes super tight with her on a long lens and we never see the faces of the kids, right? My thought in that sequence was she was gone for 6 months and all of those kids are like toddlers. Like, I'm not a parent myself, but I know that kids, they grow a lot in those time periods, right? There's a big difference between a 5-year-old and a 6-year-old. She didn't see her kids for 6 months and nobody really, like, Nick like tried to stop her from doing that, right?
Yeah.
The fact that Nick's mom even lets her do that, right? That's the kindest thing that Nick's mom ever does for Mabel in the entire movie, too.
Yes. That's when she was finally identifying her with her as a mother, because they never explained why is it that they weren't taken there for visits. Was it that they weren't allowed? Nick didn't want to bring them there or whatnot? Because before she's sent off, she's talking to Dr. Zepp and she's like, okay, fine. She's kind of agreeing to being taken away, but she's like, you got to let me take my kids with me. She's like, I can't leave them. It's just so sad.
The cut in that scene that kills me, it's right at the end of that scene. It's when the doctor finally serves the notice that she's being instituted, right? Like he's starting to like put the hammer down and we cut away mid-sentence. Like the wave of just like pain hits me right there, right? Like that's one of those moments that like I said, it always gets to that point where you don't have Mabel in the picture that like really gets to me, right? And that is it right there.
There's a lot of cuts in this film where it's like there's a scene, they're in mid-sentence and it cuts and you're like, okay, it's up to you to figure out what was said afterwards.
It cuts at a really interesting place too, right? Because the last thing we see in the film is they close the doors to the bedroom and we peer through the window and it's Nick undressing Mabel, right? And what's interesting is that we allude to these times of peace with Nick and Mabel, but we never see it. We never like actually see what they're like when they're alone, right? And yet, like, this is like the one time we get it, and it's almost like silence. And I think I said it before, but it's all like a lot of this is like primal, right? Like a lot of this is like they fall into like these modes that just feel natural to their current situation. With that ending, right? I inferred that this was kind of like the start of an abusive relationship. And with abusive relationships, right, whether it be the guy or the girl who's getting abused, they're always going to look to those wonderful glimmers of the past, right? Yep. They're always going to be like, but it was great when it was like this. And in a really sad way, like that last scene is one of those moments. It's like one of those moments where Mabel's seeing the good. She's like, that I've got time alone with my husband and we're just doing something menial, but it doesn't matter because it's with us together. The music is really dorky, but I think that if we didn't have something so dorky like that, the movie wouldn't be like, it wouldn't be such an iconic ending, right? Like it's one of those perfect juxtapositions that while you're watching it, you're not quite sure how to feel, but upon reflection, it makes sense. It's like a corrupted sitcom. That's the way it feels.
It could have been one of those endings where you don't really want to go back and rewatch this because you're feeling empty, whereas this doesn't make you feel empty that way, where you're like, I need to go back and rewatch stuff I might have missed, or I want to just kind of understand these people better. When she's having her break, when she gets back from the institution, everyone's left now, Nick's kicked everyone out, and she eventually tries to injure herself. And the kids are screaming. It's just like, it's a very heavy scene. And the kids are screaming. They're saying it. We don't understand, Mom. We don't understand what's happening, what's going on. And there's no way for them to understand. They're children. They shouldn't even be subjected to that, unfortunately. Hey, Nick does try to get the kids upstairs, but they want to see their mom. They haven't seen her. And then she goes up on the couch and starts doing the Swan Lake because she wants to remove herself from that situation. You can see even when he hits her and she's on the ground, the kids are screaming. She just kind of is like staring off into the distance. She's disassociating from the situation because she's seeking something that will calm her down and bring her back to the ground, essentially. What a way to end that movie.
One of my favorite acting decisions in this film comes from the kids. It's after Nick returns. It's when Nick's like yelling at Mabel as she's still on the couch after he's hit her. And the kids just keep on like trying to get Nick to like lift him up. Right. And it's like one of those moments where it's like Cassavetes is a fucking genius because the kids don't even know what they're trying to do. What the kids are doing, they're asking to be held. Right. But subconsciously they're trying to distract their father to leave the mother alone. Right. And like I was watching it last night and I was like, oh my God, like I need to go for a walk. That's so depressing. That Swan Lake dancing at the end, she only does it after everyone ignores her, you know, like she is having like a huge breakdown in that moment, I guess, but she asked them repeatedly to leave. No one respected her wishes. Now she's doing that. It's really sad, really, when you look at it, because even though it's definitely a dated approach to mental illness on the part of the players, not Cassavetes, and it's they have an outdated worldview in that sense. But it's sad to see how prevalent a lot of the same ideologies persist today. You know, and even within like circles that state that their goals are to support mental health struggles, many of them don't really understand that the first step comes with listening. And this film is pretty much all about that.
I think that's also like a theme in his other films too. You see it in Minnie Moskowitz, where some character even mentions to her that she's a great listener. I think probably because Cassavetes is a great listener. He clearly is someone who listens and learns and then brings forth that into his work.
One of my favorite bits of comedy in this movie is when Mabel's father, he sees Mabel come in through the door and he's like, okay, I'm leaving. I'm done. I'm not eating spaghetti. I can't do it again. I am over spaghetti. Mabel's dad just doesn't care about her. I think that that's a reflection also of the patriarchy on how men and fathers didn't really care about their daughters in that time period, but also just the baseline. I'm sick of spaghetti and I can't have it again. Like this movie is hilarious. It is in my eyes, right? Like even though it's so deeply unsettling and it's got so much sadness in it, there are so many things that you just kind of have to laugh at the absurdity of it all. And the fact that this guy is just breaking down because he can't eat another plate of spaghetti. It's so like, it's something that someone would get upset about, right?
Yeah.
Like it's so lived in.
I meant to bring up that point because that is like a point of funniness because it's just so normal in a sense to just be like, I can't eat this again. On a deeper point of what you said of he not caring about her, there's that scene where she's kind of sitting not on his lap, she's sitting on the arm of the chair and he's in the chair. She says, how am I doing, Dad? And she's kissing him. It's kissing him for a long time where you start to get kind of uncomfortable and he says, go sit near your mom. You know, go sit with your mom because he's just trying to be like, I can't handle this. You need to go off to your mother who should be handling this instead of him. And he's immediately trying to get it to the point where it took me a while to realize until they explicitly said it that he was her dad because there's no mention of him before this. You don't see him before you see her mom. Definitely a couple other scenes with Nick that are funny because he's just so over the top. Even when he's like, let's go to the beach. I'm going to rip the kids out of school to go to the beach. And he's like yelling at them to have fun. It's like the kids are just not enjoying themselves as they wouldn't. Or he gives this kid a sip of beer. He's like, okay, that's enough. It's like, this kid is like 7 years old.
They're in the back of a truck with no actual seats. They're just in the truck bed.
Different times, I guess.
Another scene that I thought was like brilliant. What's interesting about this film is that there was no credited cinematographer. It was just like the gaffers, you know. The best scene of camera work, if I were to painstakingly lay it out, it's during that concluding Swan Lake scene, and it's right at the moment when Nick slaps her. She's dancing on the couch, and the camera goes out of focus on her. You actually lose focus on Mabel when that happens. We cut back to Nick. He runs up, and when he slaps her, they change the shutter speed, which is something that happens a few times in this film. And whenever a filmmaker changes the shutter speed, in my mind, it's usually a horror film, zombie movie thing, right? When you want to see the zombies running really fast, 28 Days does it a lot. To see it in a family drama, when you're seeing like a husband and a wife really going at it, right? I think that's like a brilliant decision. It's like hyper reality. It's not so much a higher frame rate, but the fact that the shutter speed is faster, the actions are so herky jerky, and it feels more real while also being more surreal. The film does that a few times, and I think it's one of the better tricks that Cassavetes has up his sleeves, because I don't think that people are even pulling out of focus trick shots out there. That's crazy. Who would think of that?
That's also one of my favorite scenes, especially visually. I had it in my notes of like that scene where that happens. You can the way it kind of fuzzes up essentially is mirrors where her mind is at. And when he slaps her, it brings her back, in his sense, back to reality. And that's why we get the change. And it's like, it's subtle enough. You might not notice it the first time, depending on how you're viewing the film. But like every time I see it, I'm just like, wow. I'm going to shift to the last portion of the show, which is a little lighter because this is a heavy movie. So we're going to get into something a little lighter. So the end credits. First question is, if someone comes up to you and they're like, hey, I've never seen a Cassavetes film. Where should I start? Which film out of his filmography would you recommend they start with, and why?
I think I would go with this movie. I think I would say A Woman Under the Influence. It's like the Rosetta Stone to which you can understand the rest of Cassavetes' work through. And it's not to say that the rest of his filmography is lesser. It's just different, right? But the reason that this film is such a great place to start is because you see the best that it could be. You see like when everything is firing on all cylinders, this is how it turns out. And again, that's not to say that the other films are less successful. They're just different. Maybe like, I think Shadows, I would say, it's a little rough around the edges at points. Same thing with Faces as well. But, once you get to things like Killing of a Chinese Bookie and Opening Night, right? Like they're all great films, but you kind of have to have A Woman Under the Influence in the back of your mind while you're watching those movies. I think that the thing that will stick with you while you're watching this movie, it's to touch on the music again, actually a bit. And we didn't touch on this before, but there's a woman who's singing on the song of all of the score. And I'm not sure if it's Roland's or not, but in my mind, I always thought it was. In my mind, I always kind of heard it as her voice, and we never see her sing in the movie. We always see her hum, right? And she only sings on the soundtrack. That's what sticks in my mind when I think about this movie. I think about the struggling of a woman to get her voice out there. And she can't. And the film is within her mind. So we see everything that she wants to say, but we can't. No one else can hear it. It's a tragedy.
I definitely agree. It's not actually the first one I did watch. I think the first one I watched was Shadows. But I think if I were to recommend, I would start here because it gives you everything you need to know about Cassavetes' work. And then you can branch off from there. Because some of the other ones, depending on who you are, sometimes, like as I said, I watched Shadows first and I was intrigued to watch. But that could also Shadows or Faces, as you say, could push you off, or Husbands, where you're like, this is aggressive. I don't know if I could watch this. So start off with something that is hard to watch, but it's gives you everything you need to know. If you don't like this movie, then not to say you won't like the other ones, but I don't know if maybe Cassavetes is your person if this is not the film for you.
I think it's also important to say we've talked a lot about how heavy this movie is, but it's still really funny. Right? Like we've touched about on how aggressive and downtrodden a lot of it is. But even on my first watch, I was cracking up a lot. And it's not because I was demeaning those characters. It's because if you're really tuned in, I think that you can really key into the absurdity inherent in every situation. It's a comedy of errors at a certain point. And
second question, last question, is the double bill question. And if you're pairing this film with another film to make a double bill, what film or films would you pair it with?
Well, this was a tough one because I think I alluded to it before, but the Woman in Peril subgenre of films, I think that this is almost like the definitive text of that subgenre. Yeah. And so much so that I wouldn't call it a woman in peril. This is just a woman trapped. You did like there is no escape when the film starts and we just watch it. But anyways, the reason I bring that up is because the Woman in Peril films speak a lot about the filmmakers based on how they're handled. And I brought up Lars von Trier before. And if we're talking about films that are close one-to-ones, I would probably go with Breaking the Waves as the film to pair with A Woman Under the Influence. However, I think that film doesn't treat Emily Watson's character as appropriately or with as much respect as A Woman Under the Influence. So I kind of wanted to stay away from this movie, but the more that I thought about it, the more I was like, no, this is actually perfect. I should recommend this one. It came out last year. It's Resurrection. Rebecca Hall.
Okay.
Have you seen that one before or no?
No, I haven't. I do know it. Is Tim Roth also in that movie?
Yes. And I don't want to spoil it for you. I don't want to spoil it for you, but I have to say, I guess this is to spoil the conceit of the, right? Is the idea that we have this like really well put together woman who's a business like head, right? Like she's running her own company. And then when her abuser re-enters her life, she starts to fall back into the mode that she was in when she was being abused. Right.
Okay.
And it's told under the guise of a horror film. Right. And with Rebecca Hall's recent string of performances, I believe she's in her early 40s. A lot of actresses, when they get to this age range, two things happen. A, they start to get less roles because of inherent sexism within the film industry, and there aren't many parts that are written for women in that age bracket. But B, or two, whatever I said, I forget it was A, letters or numbers. But anyways, the second thing that happens is many actresses want to have their woman under the influence role. And they fight for it, right? I'm not going to run down on the examples of it, right? But I'm pretty sure you can think of an actress and they have done their version of Gina Rollins in A Woman Under the Influence. And Rebecca Hall, she's done it a few times now. There was a 2016 film called Christine, where she plays a news anchor that kills herself on screen. With Resurrection, this is a film where you watch somebody at the top fall to the bottom. And that's something we don't see in A Woman Under the Influence. So I guess hats off to Rebecca Hall just showing that whole range. It's not as intellectually smart or thematically dense, but the last 30 minutes are harrowing. And if you've ever been abused, if you've ever been in a situation where someone uses mental health against you, it is probably one of the most disturbing films I put the screen. I remember I was like literally like gripping the seat. I was like, this is like, it feels evil almost. I say all of that because mental health is not something that is explored thoroughly on screen, and Resurrection at least feels like one of the rare examples of a new release that actually manages to do something different with it and manages something that's not 100% positive and not 100% negative. Certainly would recommend it for you and for your audience.
Yeah, it had been on my watch list because I like Rebecca Hall, I like Christine, I like Tim Roth. I don't know, maybe it was the way it was marketed as like this super sort of horror film that like the way you described it, I would never known it was about that. So now I'm more interested in watching it. I just thought maybe it was going to be too scary for me. I thought it was like some weird, I don't know what I thought, but the trailer made it seem like it was more of like slashery than I guess it is.
Oh yeah, it's not a slasher.
That's good. That's good to know. So
do you get scared easily though?
So I like horror, but I don't watch any sort of modern anything like post the 80s because I hate jump scares.
Oh yeah.
I can't do the jump scares, and I find that modern horror films rely on it so heavily that I can't sit and watch it without being stressed the whole time. Like I'm just stressed waiting for it to happen, so I just avoid them at all costs. I like a thriller. I like something that will disturb me, but I don't want to be jumped out. I'm more of like a disturbing type of movie person than something that'll jump out and scare me type of deal.
I asked that because Resurrection is so much more about the conversations. That's where a lot of the fear comes from, right? And Tim Roth is terrifying. I don't think that I've seen him in a role like that before. So yeah, I say all of that because it's not jumpy, but you will probably be hearing Tim Roth say words that will make your skin crawl. Like there are things he says in that film that made me want to have a shower immediately. So that should give you an idea. But I want to ask, what would you pair with A Woman Under the Influence?
So I'll kind of rapid fire the three that I have because they're similar. There's just three different movies going along the lengths of pairing other films about women who are going through either addiction or mental health issues or both. And the fact that we don't see that in the way it treats them, that's sort of similar to the way it's treated in this film. So the first one was Wanda, Barbara Loden, 1970, which is about a woman who has her own family and just kind of leaves because she can't handle it and goes on an adventure of her own. Adventure being the nicest way to put that. She just goes out. She needs to leave. And the things that happened to her, being just a woman on her own, living that life. Starring also Barbara Loden, who directed it. So that's a great one. Another one was Rachel, which Paul Newman directed. It's about a woman she's a school teacher, but you can see she's incredibly repressed and she's being pushed into these roles of what a woman's supposed to be. Why is she not married? When is she going to have kids? And just to see the mental decay that happens to her because she cannot conform to the life that's expected of her and what happens to her there. So that's also great. One, and the last one is Days of Wine and Roses, which is Blake Edwards, 1962. And I think that's his best one. That's Lee Remick and Jack Lemmon. And Jack Lemmon, they're a couple. He's an alcoholic. She wants to conform to him. She wants to, relate to her husband. So she starts drinking with him. It overtakes her. And to the point where he becomes sober because he has to take care of her and just the dealing with her as a mother because they eventually have a kid who's an alcoholic and dealing with her eventual mental illness that was always there. It just surfaced up with everything that was happening to her. So those are the three that I would pair if you want to see other films that tackle that subject, that despite the fact that that's 4 movies about it, there's still not a lot compared to the times we see those stories as they revolve around men. So those are the ones. It would be a heavy night, but they're all great and they're very much actors movies. These are the actors putting out their best performances. So those are the ones I'd recommend.
I have not seen any of these movies, and I have now kept them in my search bar, and I will be watching them soon because they all sound amazing.
Oh, they're great. They're great. I feel like Wanda might be on Criterion Channel right now, but I know Rachel recently got released on Blu-ray. I think it was Warner Archives. So I'm sure that's up on the internet somewhere. And then Days of Wine and Roses is common enough to find, I think. So I don't think that you would have any issues finding, you or any listeners, to watch them. I would highly recommend all of them. But I think that was A Woman Under the Influence. That was a great conversation. Like, I had a blast. It's great talking to someone who's so passionate about this film and Cassavetes and so eloquent. I was like, wow, conversation. I could have just let you, lead the way on this. You should have your own show. And I hope that you want to come back for another show because there's so many things I'm sure that we have in common that we want to talk about. But thank you so much for coming on. I really, really appreciate it.
Well, I really appreciate you having me, Felicia. I love shows that essentially view work within the context of a larger career, right? And I think that when it comes to looking at people's work, it's best to consider it in totality as well as how it happened chronologically, I guess is how you'd phrase it. But I say that to say that I love that your show is taking a look at not just directors and cinematographers as well. And with Cassavetes specifically, he is like voice who is going away. And I think that we need to hold tight to him. I had a blast talking today and I really enjoyed this. And if you'd like to have me back, just say the time, say the date, just tell me the director or the cinematographer and I'll be there.
That we've got a plan there. Seeing Faces in Movies is an official podcast of the Royal Film Club. It's hosted and edited by Felicia and Ronnie, with intro music by Lamar Walker. If you like what you heard, let us know at seeingfacesinmovies.com or send us an email at seeingfacesinmovies@gmail.com. And while you're at it, please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to your podcast. And stay tuned for our next episode on The Killing of a Chinese Bookie.